Welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Knight. I'm co-director and editor of Shuddhashar FreeVoice, and I'm really honored to be able to welcome our guests today, Kaniqua Robinson and Gayatri Menon. I am also professor of anthropology at Furman University, and where my colleague Kaniqua is also located. And we are here today to talk about invisible labor, inmates, migrants, and the politics of disposability in India and the US. And this is based on two very interesting articles that Kaniqua and Gayatri both wrote, looking at labor and the invisibility of that labor and the invisibilization of those laborers in two very different contexts. And so I'm excited to have this conversation because of both the differences but also a lot of the interesting and important, I think, interconnections. And so excited to hear what you both have to say about your work. And I know that our listeners and readers will appreciate also learning more about your work. So Kaniqua Robinson is a cultural anthropologist, like as I said, at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. She has been working on the US criminal justice system, and there's many things to say about her work. She teaches about race and racism, and Gayatri Menon is a sociologist. She works on the political economy of development, focusing on urbanization, displacement, and questions of home. And Gayatri right now is working on a project on urban health with the Public Health Foundation in India's Ramaswamy Center on Equity and Social Determinants of Health. And so those are some brief introductions to both of you. And I will mention also the two articles that both of you wrote about. As I said, they're covering different areas, but within very interesting intersections. So Gayatri's article is looking at the migrants during the pandemic. The title of her article is Silent Footfall, India's Migrant Worker Crisis. And so it's taking that moment in time when India shut down and the migrants who had been working in urban areas had to flee with no notice and find their way home, right? And so, and all the implications of that caravan, of that movement from their places of work to their home villages, home areas. And Kaniqua Robinson's article has a very intriguing sort of quote, which I hope that you will mention and talk about a little bit. It starts off with, except as a punishment for crime, end quote, Black labor and the US criminal justice system. And in that article, Kaniqua talks about well, gives a nice overview of the history of labor in the US, especially the history of African-American labor in the US and how it's manifest in the criminal justice system today. So lots of really intriguing points that both of you make about these communities. They're not the same communities, but there's a lot I think that we can learn about human dignity and you know, not just labor, but also like what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to count and to matter from these articles? Mm-hmm. So with that as sort of an introduction, I would love to hear first how these pieces connect to some of the other things, and this way, you know, our readers, our listeners can get to know a little bit more about what you do as well. So, Kaniqua, would you like to start with that? How does this piece connect to your other work?
Well, first, thank you so much. I'm really excited about this discussion, and I'm really happy too that we're talking about these important topics that are affecting people today. The reason why this article was important to me is because it directly ties into understanding the criminal justice system, which is the main part of my research. I do research on a reform school in Florida, and it really was regarding juvenile boys who were incarcerated for various reasons, but really speaks to the over-incarcerations of Black juveniles, Black youth. And so this piece ties to how the criminal justice system has functioned to make sure that Black people, youth, and adults are always available for free labor. And so it directly ties to my work that I'm already doing in regards to race and racism in this country, and why the position of Black people in this country and the over-incarceration of Black people in this country, and why there is an over-incarceration of Black people in this country, and how it's directly tied to race and capitalism.
Yeah. And Gayatri, would you share a little bit about how this interconnects with your work and interest?
Sure. And thank you to everyone at Shuddhashar for initiating this conversation. And I'm trained as a historical sociologist, and my interest has always been looking at invisibilization and othering of poverty, and the kind of the historical processes of marginalization, and whether it was looking at indebtedness or it was looking at housing crises, and various other kind of sites of social reproduction, looking at the ways in which populations are rendered invisible, and their struggles for visibility on a range of different terms has always been something of interest to me. And my work has, covered everything from looking at informal settlements in India's big cities, to looking at currently looking at the ways in which urban health is talked about, and the ways in which that it is in fact talked about actually is does not acknowledge that the vast majority of urban India, for example, lives in informal settlements and works in highly informalized employment situations, right? And I think if we need to think about any of these categories of governance that we have, whether it is urban health, education, without actually acknowledging the conditions in which people live and work and love and fight, it's always going to be complicit in the production of invisibility.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One of the things that, and you both sort of touched on this, is one of the things you both talk about is the way in which our societies are so much built on these peoples and their the labor. And I think, Gayatri, you talked about this as, the migrant crisis was revealed the impoverished foundations on which India's growth story rests, right? So India's success story, is dependent on the migrant workers, right? And on people who often we don't know their names. We don't know, there's so much we don't know about them because of how they are rendered invisible. Can you say a little bit more about obviously, some people are benefiting from this, but what is this telling us about the system of, India's growth, for example?
I think, Lisa, there are a couple of different ways to kind of look at that fairly straightforward question, right? One is that, yes, India is, by recent IMF reports, if they're to be believed, it is supposed to be the fifth largest economy in the world, and will soon be moving up that ladder as well. It has apparently an enviable growth rate, etc. And I say all of this as apparently or possibly, because I think there are so many stories and lives and livelihoods that don't somehow get featured in the production of these figures. And I think one part of it is, you look at the fact, one way to answer that question that you're asking me about, yes, there is an entire, this is obviously a very fast growing economy where is that growth coming from?
Mhm. Mhm.
We can look at the fact that the vast majority of Indians still are located in the unorganized economy. We also know that there's a kind of steadily growing jobs crisis. We know that the growth is very inequitable, right? And so we can possibly think that, if we are to say, we can possibly say that the growth is produced out of the labors of this highly exploited workforce. But the fact is, growth is also today's economic figures. And I'm not an economist, but speculative capitalism is a fundamental part of it. So I'm not entirely sure that the story of jobs and the story of growth are as closely linked as we think it is.
Mhm.
The second thing that I wanted to say is that when we look at who's benefiting from this growth, it would be nice to be able to say these are the big billionaires. And of course, India has had more than its fair share of billionaires whose wealth is immediately derived from the labor of these highly exploited populations. But to be fair, everyone has benefited from, every middle-class person has benefited from this highly exploited labor force. Young women in the middle class will not be able to go to work unless they have a range of people that whose labor they can hire to take care of all the work that needs to be done in the house. There are a range of whether all kinds of care work and various other kinds of the work of social reproduction. So I think, yes, there are Indian companies, corporates that definitely derive from this extremely cheap labor force. But I think more broadly, and this is part of the ways in which this kind of exploitation, I would argue, is legitimized, is that, it's much more than those small groups of people that stand to benefit from this structure of exploitation.
I think that's a really interesting and important point that we often forget, right, is the ways in which the middle class benefit as well. We tend to blame the larger corporations or the wealthy few, and for sure they do benefit, but the whole system and structure is functions, right, and which it is, when you talk about India, I think about, yes, no household can run very easily without the help of all these other workers, right? And so it structurally there is a strong link with sort of the middle class also benefiting from this. So Kaniqua, when you think about your work with the laborers that you're talking about, where do you see the connections and differences?
It goes back to what you both were saying, talked about, I wrote it down. I was like, India's success story is based on migrant labor, right? Because the US success story is based on enslavement and slavery. The reason that America is so economically well today is because of slavery. And it's, again, slavery has been the abuse of Black bodies for the support of the white elite, but not just the elite, but how do we protect the elite, right? So we have to first understand capitalism and why capitalism exists in the first place, right? It was about greed. How do you have people, oh, I want the most money. Oh, well, we can get cheap labor or free labor by exporting people to just work. And also we can keep them working and we can keep amassing wealth. Oh, but we have to prevent different classes of white people from, rebelling against the elite. Oh, well, what we have to do is we have to generate racist ideas that help people understand that Black people are less than they're supposed to work. And so you start seeing these different tropes happening just to make sure we have a strong foundation for cheap labor and a strong bottom for the capitalistic top. And so again, since slavery, since slavery, even now, when we think about the criminal justice system, in order for America to be successful today, you have to have a cheap working class or a cheap labor. You have to have a working class. And there has been different rules and laws set up to make sure that Black people, other people of color cannot move up and down the social or economic ladder. And so even when we talk about race, race in itself meant economic inequality. If we are to ever achieve racial equality, we must have economic empowerment. And I speak of this, let me speak of, I grew up in it was an impoverished African American community. Had a great time. I love my people. It was fantastic. They were awesome. Enjoyed my life. We always worked. Everybody was working. Working has been a part of our existence here in America. Working has become a part of our tradition, our culture, our status. We have always worked. So much so that we don't even know how to take a break. When we're talking about soft life today, we're like, what is that? We always worked. And we worked so much that people never even saw our work. Outside of slavery, you start thinking about the feminist movement. When like, oh, we want women to work. We've always worked. So even the feminist movement didn't work for us because we were always working. As women, during World War II, everyone's like, oh, now we're working these different places. We've been cleaning your houses. We've been working the fields. We've been doing cheap labor. Even now, we're working, but we're not getting paid enough. I grew up in an impoverished community. Everyone seemed like they were working full time to me, especially in my house, but we still could not break through the economic ladder, the social ladder, the social hierarchy, as well as the economic ladder, because capitalism plays a role in, first of all, when we think about economic power, economic ascendancy, is the wealth of our nation is dependent on people who are willing to do the work, to the people who are willing to be pawns in this bigger regime, right? In order to do that, you disenfranchise them economically because money is power. And so in order to protect your power, you have to make sure other people don't have theirs. And then you're stripping them of money. That means and then you also at the same time stripping them of their humanity when you say, okay, well, you're nothing but your work. And when you can no longer work in the way we need you, why do you matter? And so again, when you have America whose success story is literally based on slavery and the abuse and the working of Black bodies, and now you're saying, hey, we want to be equal. They're like, what do you mean? What do you mean you want equality? We're only here and we're only great because we used your bodies. So what do you mean? How do we change that today? So yeah, I know it's a lot, but yeah. But I even see this when we talk about, migrant labor. They're working, right? But it's like, oh, but they could be disregarded. We don't care about them no more. Yes, you do, because you need them. But you only need them in the way that you need them.
Absolutely.
You don't need them to be autonomous. You don't need them to have agency. You need them for you. You are not a person. You are my item to be used. Your social being have been erased.
Right, and then very easily replaceable, right?
Easily replaceable. Like, the convict leasing system. One dies, you get another one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, someone died, whatever. We can always get another person to put in this system.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think I just want to tack on to something that Kaniqua's talking about, right? I mean, the actual kind of physical abuse of the body that is part of this set of arrangements, right, through which wealth is produced. And in India, for example, the FAO in 2021 pointed out that 74.1% of Indians were unable to afford a healthy diet, right? That you had, I think India accounts for 1/3 of the global burden of malnutrition. You have terrifying levels of child wasting and stunting. And this is the way in which this is this is not a food story or a health story.
Right.
This is a story of how wealth is produced.
Mm-hmm. And that makes a good point, because even here we have issues with health, right? You have people of color struggling for health equity, just to be seen by a doctor, to be considered, a person when you go into a medical office and be heard. And the thing is, we have facts, we have data on it, we have research on it, we have all these things to prove that people of color are dying, not because they are trying to die, but because the resources are not there. Okay, now that we know this, now what? Now what? And so, I mean, yes, where, you have people who are struggling with high blood pressure, struggling with diabetes, because if you have Black communities being pushed out of the city into these areas where where they do not have land to farm their own food, to make their own food, they also don't have healthy food options. And you want them to be healthy, but they don't have healthy food options. But also, don't forget, you want them to work. They have no time to cook. So they have to get something quick, because they're like, okay, look, I can heat them and eat them because I have to go to work. I may have to work 2 shifts. So now they're stressed. And then next thing you know, it's like, oh, you have high blood pressure, you have diabetes. Okay, well, I need to go to the doctor to get an insulin shot. Well, you don't have great health care. How are you going to afford that? Okay, I finally afford that, but these pills and stuff they're too much money. Well, I'm sorry, your insurance doesn't work. So again, if you don't have money, you can't care for yourself. If you have money, then you will die. But don't forget to work. But it doesn't matter. When you die, we will hire someone new.
Kaniqua, how do you think that the narrative around immigration in the U.S. fits into that problem as well? So I'm just thinking about, like, so here we have really convincing evidence that African Americans don't have access to the same kinds of resources in general, right? Of course, there are always exceptions.
Yes.
And if they are invisibilized and not seen as valuable enough, right, to provide access in the same ways that there's access available to other people in society. So are they then just replaced by immigrants? I don't want to, like, put together this conspiracy thing,
Right.
just in terms of just the capitalist structure of
Exactly. I think immigrants have become another scapegoat.
Mhm.
Where it's like, okay, now you have immigrants who are another form of invisible labor. Where it's like, we just need to see you move when we need you to move. We don't want to give more resources to you. We do not want to provide humanity to you. You're supposed to move the way we want you to move. You are the bottom half to be seen and not heard type thing. And so in the fact of, yes, you have African Americans who do not have the resources. Of course, we have African Americans who have resources. We have people, so this is not like a royal all African Americans. But you have African Americans at the bottom of the ladder, where now it's like, okay, we have the immigrant population. Oh, they're stealing our jobs. They're taking, our resources from us. We should not give to them. And one thing about capitalism, for racial capitalism to truly work, you have to split the lower class. And that's how it works, where it's like, okay, well, you may be a lower class white person, a working class white person, either way, a working class white person, but at least you're not Black. So you're better than them. So you may be a working class white person, a working class Black person, but at least you're not an immigrant. So blame other groups, but don't blame the top for keeping the resources from coming to you. So immigrants have become the other scapegoat. Another reason to say, oh, it's really them as to why you don't have. And so in doing that, you have to ensure that they do not have power either. because once they have power, then, you know, that would disrupt the whole, you know, capitalistic system we have. So I don't put them at odds with each other. I just think that they're both groups, Black people, you know, we're being used as pawns as well as immigrants are being used as pawns. And again, the way for capitalism to work, you have to fracture the working class. I'm not an economist, but I'm just saying.
Right. Gayatri, do you see something similar in terms of just sort of the, you know, divide and conquer kind of efforts or pitting different groups together against each other in order to control them better in terms of the migrant
No,
workers?
definitely. You do see that. And you know, I mean, when you look at migrant labor, you know, the great sociologist of migrant labor in India, Jan Bremen, talks a lot about the fact that, I mean, he came up with this wonderful term, wage hunters and gatherers, to talk about what does it mean to what is the status of the laborer in capitalism. And what you see in India is, and I'm sure in very many other parts of the world, is that even if you are historically located within a particular area, that does not necessarily mean you'll get a job in that area. They would rather hire someone from elsewhere, right? Because those people are at a political disadvantage. They have, they will get their ability to organize, their ability to demand accountability is all diminished, right?
Right.
So you will have workers in rural Gujarat migrating to a neighboring state, workers from that state migrating to rural Gujarat to be hired, right? And so you have this process by which you are always looking at how to build in these kinds of divisions and how to create ways in which you know, there's a politics of othering that is very much built in to the process of lowering the wage, of lowering the ability to organize. I think too that when we think about these divisions, like in India, again, you know, you either it is regional basis or it is on the basis of caste. Dr. Ambedkar very kind of famously talked about not just divisions between capital and labor, but within labor itself, and the ways in which caste becomes a process of ensuring little niches of power within the working class, where each one is just so grateful not to be on that rung below, right? And there are stakes then in building this kind of graduated form of labor. But I think lastly, right, I mean, labor also and capital are global. And nationalist politics will always seek to figure out how to harness that global process of exploitation and accumulation in ways that work for them. And particularly in the US, right, you will talk about the immigrant labor as if capital in the US had no hand in producing that very constituency.
Exactly.
I think so that those scales of analysis that we have to equip ourselves with in order to understand these politics and to be able to organize around these politics has to recognize the huge stakes that nationalists have in ensuring that you don't look beyond the border.
Exactly.
It's such a good point.
It reminds me of, you know, well, not reminds me of, I was not alive during that time, but Bacon's Rebellion. How you had the working class white people, you had indigenous people, and you had free Black people in America fighting against the elite. And they said, oh, okay. Well, they lost, of course. Oh, okay, so you want to rebel. bet we're going to make sure that you all remain separate. We're going to make sure that you all never align again. We're going to create these divides. But I'm glad you even brought that point where it's like, yes, it's national politics, but how has capitalism made these fractures nationwide, but globally? What does it look like on the global scale? How can we unite, even as activists on the global scale, in having these conversations?
So that's a good question. How can we? I mean, even just, locally, nationally, and the next step sort of globally. I mean, those are huge questions, but how do we begin to look at people as not the other, so, but as part of us?
Yeah, that's a hard question. That's because even like nationally, how do we have almost like a town hall where we can all sit down and say, hey, we're all fighting the same battle. We should not fight each other. Because even within the group, we sometimes fight each other. We internalize the same inequality that we're trying to fight. You also have to be willing to say, okay, hey, we're all fighting the same battle. But we have to first put aside our own biases, or at least address them, because you can't put aside your own biases. Are we willing to move beyond our comfort, even a little bit, even though we're not comfortable? Are we willing to do that? And what does that look like when we know forces are actively fighting against us?
Yeah, I think that question of sort of like internalization, right, is also so interesting. Like, how do we break that open and stop internalizing our inequities and the system that values certain bodies over other bodies, and
Right.
In the Indian context, I so often think about this in terms of the caste system, right, and sort of how that's embodied in a certain kind of logic. Obviously very problematic logic, but we see it also with class. You've been mentioning, Gayatri, also regional, differences and divisions. Then you have, religion, right? And the way, especially in Modi's India, using religion as a way to divide people even further.
Right.
What are some of the efforts, and do we see efforts, maybe big or small, to try to counteract that in terms of just, it could be through unionization or other sort of political moves to try to create more connections with each other and try to really understand what the real enemy is, what the real challenge is, what the real structure that is in place that is limiting us is.
So I can speak a little bit about it from kind of the government workers' kind of efforts to try and understand and recognize and mobilize around these very issues. So you have, this coalition called the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, where government workers in various Asian countries recognize that they had much more in common with each other than they had with, the elite in their own countries, and try to mobilize and challenge the corporations who are kind of invested in these huge global value chains, to try and figure out, can we create a floor wage so we aren't constantly pitted against each other in this race to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of those efforts have been extremely encouraging. However, it is a very challenging situation, right? The forms of accountability that vest in you as a citizen is directed towards the national or federal government.
Mm-hmm.
That is supposed to secure your body and your ability to live and flourish in that sovereign space. And yet the processes that you are that are shaping your livelihood are not just national. They are actors with whom you don't have these kinds of systems of accountability. And I think what has been very valuable, and from the garment workers organizing in various parts of the world, really, has been to shed light on what kinds of accountability can be built into these accumulation strategies that derive from these global value chains. And I think that has been, part of the inspiration of this kind of globe, because they have made things work.
Right.
They have been able to effect certain kinds of floors below which you will not go. Now, of course, we know that those floors are porous, but I do think I do not want to take anything away from those absolutely amazing efforts to create systems of accountability where there were none.
Right, right. And I can, even add to that in the American context, like, for example, in regards to voting, how you have different voting unions, or not unions, but organizations, such as like Black Voters Matter. You have Stacey Abrams making a lot of headway in Georgia, getting people registered to vote. Even when there was, like, still is, not their word, but, still is gerrymandering going on, where you having people being disenfranchised today. And you still have these organizations actively working to register, re-register people to vote. And even when you think about, let's go to prisons, when you have unions in prisons, right? And they have worked to some degree in the fact of they may not have changed a lot of prison politics, but they've gotten the word outside of prison to the community about what's going on inside. Even when you think about, I would use an example of the Attica prison riot that was in the 70s. It was a huge prison riot, right? People died, but they made a strong statement. Just because someone's a prisoner doesn't mean they're not human. Today, when COVID happened, you have prisoners like, don't forget about us. We're inside and we're dying. And so they were able to get out via social media in so many ways, by forming these unions, by even simple things like writing letters at home, getting it out like, you guys were suffering here. There may not have been much change, but the community outside we were pretty much taught to, when someone is a prisoner, we are to forget about them. We then began to say, oh no, these are humans now. Like, these are still humans. We cannot let them perish in inhumane, conditions, because they were literally dying. Even now in Alabama, you have prisoners, Alabama and Georgia, you have prisoners who are in these, first of all, it's hot, and they don't have air conditioning. And so you start seeing people, these organizations forming, saying, we're going to make sure that we are fighting on behalf of prisoners, because they are human. We will restore the humanity to our people who have been discarded. Yes, they may have committed a crime. Many of them may have not, but they are still humans regardless. So, like you said, in India, here, there have been some strides where, even if it has not been tremendous change, it has brought attention to a huge problem. And that's also why I like social media. I know some people may argue with that. I like social media. I'm not going to be on social media, but, I appreciate social media in bringing light to police brutality. We have a whole Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, Latino Lives Matter. Like, it's so many lives mattering because of social media saying, hey, this is a movement to say these things are happening. We've been telling you this before, but you didn't want to listen. So we're now going to use a new resource to get this out. And so I think one thing I do appreciate is that, you have the younger generation using the new technology, using the young energy to say, no, we're going to actually make efforts to make visible what has been invisible. We're going to listen to more voices and not just the same voices. And bring attention to once invisible groups, such as prisoners, we're going to bring attention to them now. We're going to keep talking about them. Even as prisoners getting out of prison or out of jail, they are now saying, I'm going to talk about my experience, not just as a way of saying, oh, this is what I went through, but to advocate for others. So I think there is a push. It's not huge, but there is a push to now say, okay, we have to revisit these invisible corners of America.
That's so interesting. I mean, you're both, like touching on really some different points. But the question of sort of social media and the ways in which that has brought to light some of the, inequities in the U.S., right? It has been very, very profound. And yes, people can still, push it aside and start to ignore it, but there is a huge amount of evidence, right, in the form of, now police cameras as well, and so that becomes a whole form of documentation that I think, even as much as we try to ignore it, it becomes harder and harder, right? And so, but I feel like in India things are a little bit different, and maybe you can speak to this more, Gayatri. I think in the US, we still don't have as much sort of control and regulations over social media. But, in India, there have been blackouts in terms of access to the internet. And there have been efforts by the government to silence certain things or filter things. And so do you see that as hindering some of the progress that could otherwise happen in terms of bringing to light, or maybe people aren't trying to bring to light inequities through social media in the same ways?
I think they've had to, right? Because the news media, the mainstream news media, is never going to be, if it ever was, a space for bringing to light voices, perspectives, and struggles of the marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
And I think social media has been that space. But as you very rightly point out, Lisa, there is this entire kind of culture of surveillance, and it's not just surveillance. There huge punitive dimensions to this culture around what can be said, who can say it, etc. That we have here. That I haven't thought about it in any great depth, but it is. I mean, I would hazard to say that people are very careful about what they say, even citing, fairly well-established reports can prompt all kinds of criticism and punitive action.
Mm-hmm.
When, even global institutions produce reports where they talk about malnourishment or they talk about unemployment, those are challenged as using erroneous methodologies that are conspiring to put India in a bad light.
Mm-hmm.
Then that gives you a sense of what it means to engage in these kinds of circuits, media circuits, and the risks that everyone takes in whether it is social media, whether it is a play, whether it is a comic, engaging in satire. There are multiple ways in which this extraordinary experience of inequality comes to bear down upon the people right on the margins who are risking a lot to say something. And I'm sure this is something that, for people who worked in Bangladesh for so long, have a sense of how this actually works to silence people, to silence organizing. And it's extraordinarily, there's also the toll, right, of keeping silent, of not being able to say something. And that too needs to be recognized.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. The toll of keeping silent.
That
Yeah.
is interesting. No, I was gonna say that is very interesting. Like, what does that toll look like? What does it mean when you are, constantly surveilled? You can't say anything. Your voice is silent. Like, what does that mean now and in the future? What does that mean? What does that look like? I don't know. It in the context of the U.S. again, it's completely different. Of I don't know if I would make it the same type of thing because it's a different type of surveillance. But prior to the end of Jim Crow, when you had African Americans, like, fighting constantly, civil rights movement, even prior to the civil rights movement, there have been several forms of rebellions or insurrections that has been happening since slavery. And the goal has always been to keep Black people and other groups of color from questioning, disrupting, or dismantling the status quo in any way. And so it did have become a part of, like, what does that mean? Do we now become quiet so that we won't get hurt? And then you see it in some Black families where it's like, don't speak up because we just go along to get along. So then it becomes tradition to just go along to get along so you can be great later, but don't say nothing, don't question anything because they're going to do something to you. So how does that affect when you are, you grew up in a generation where all you saw was racial violence, and you had generations after that where they're like, no, this is wrong. No, but be quiet because we don't want anything to happen to you. And so as generations and generations are growing, fortunately in this country, it's like, and just like, we've had insurrections since the beginning of time, even though there have been cases in the US which is completely different, cases in the US where people of a certain class or a certain racial group have been silenced. One thing that we have saw was that despite the forced silencing of these groups, there has always been some form of fight. And fighting may not always be in the way of, I'm going to say something. They're fighting in so many different ways. There's so many ways in which people have rebelled and resisted power, have resisted oppression. And that's why I love seeing. I love seeing how people resist differently. Like, yeah, I'm not gonna come out and cuss you out in the middle of the streets, but I know you want me to wash your clothes. I'm sorry, I stained them. You now have to go buy something else.
Right.
Because if I do something worse, then you may hurt me. But now you gotta go shopping again and waste your money. Thank you. So again, different forms of rebellion where, yes, you're forcing me into silence in this way, but I can't keep quiet.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, that it is hard to remain silent. It is risky to say something, and so sometimes strategies are, subtle or sort of behind the scenes. There are other ways in which people can sort of push back against the oppressive nature of a country or community, or and I still think, though, that the internet thing has changed some aspects of this, right? Because like you mentioned Bangladesh, right? And so, and you have so many, because of the Digital Security Act and all those laws that are in place, you like something, you post something, or you just like something on the internet, on Facebook, and it can send you to prison, right? So something so subtle as that, right? So there's a visibility now too that makes it dangerous in a way that it wasn't before.
So I want to ask a question. So and I don't want you to don't share too much, but is there power even in the invisibility at this point where invisibility then becomes the power? right? Like if you are too visible, then you could be incarcerated. So how, and and I don't know if you can even answer this question because I don't want to reveal any text or anything like that, but is there power, or how has invisibility been a source of power?
Wow. Gayatri, what do you think?
No, I do think that that's a really interesting and important part of the story, right? Of part of the kind of the epistemic framework through which we understand reality, um, renders it difficult and challenging to actually see things that don't fit into that framework. And there is a lot of organizing, a sharing, forms of social reproduction that occur within marginalized populations, precisely because more individualized forms of social reproduction are not possible. And I think that is, important and valuable to look at, not just because it allows people to survive, but also because they may in there be the kernels of a different way of organizing life. But at the same time, the absolute violence that surrounds all of us. And the silence is indeed, felt very, very as a violation. And it is in when you have to look over your shoulder for, silly things like liking something on Facebook, from posting, unemployment statistics. I mean, that's not a silly thing, but yes. One would think that's not a particularly problematic thing. I mean, how does that reconfigure our brain?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, one is also, I also think that perhaps the pervasiveness of risk in all aspects of our life, from the risk of malnutrition to the risk of being picked up to the risk of being punished. I wonder what that if that kind of leads us to where, kind of Kaniqua is kind of pointing at in terms of this power of invisibility. I do think that there are ways in which we don't see, and that invisibility can indeed be a cloak. But does it work in Harry Potter terms? I'm not persuaded.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's something that we know, I don't know, in a couple decades, people will be able to see something different. But I do hear what you're saying, Gayatri, about the ways in which that invisibility and the silencing is so detrimental, right? We experience, it's experienced bodily. It's what is it? Yes, you asked, what does it do to our minds, right? To have to be on constant alert, and to censor ourselves before we say anything, right? I think about this, in terms of some of the work that, we're doing, in the US now too, in terms of, still trying to challenge, some of the inequities in our communities, right? And, university, for example, and the care with which we have to frame things, right? So it is a constant sort of vigilance. Now, I can say also that in my experience, what helps is that there's a community, right? And so even if I have to be careful and guarded, I have a community
Right.
that I can do that with, and that understands it, right? And maybe, Kaniqua, you would say some of that is true also even in the generational experiences of African Americans, right?
Right.
And then I think about the migrant workers, Gayatri, they're I guess they do build their own communities, but they're also like they moved themselves from their homes to
Yeah. I mean,
and
there's a certain extreme form of alienation there, right? Where you don't even know where you're headed when you're picked up by the person arranging your movement to a particular job site. You do not know where you're headed. You do not know who your employer is, right? You just know the person who's got you that job and is moving you to a particular location. You have no idea where you're going next. So all of these things are a form of silencing that is deeply dehumanizing.
Yeah.
And it is a form of alienation that that does not have that salve of community that allows you to restore your humanity on a periodic basis. And I think that is what is actually quite terrifying. And that, I think, is, where kind of this idea of a social death becomes a powerful way to start thinking about what that experience of alienation, of being unable to say something, but even if you say something, unable to be heard. And I think that's one of the things that you could see was not only this process of dehumanization and in those caravans of people, but not just in the course of those caravans of people leaving the cities, but that was their experience in the city prior to the pandemic, right? The sense of alienation, working on one construction site and then moving to another, not knowing what you need to do, if your child got sick, or how you dealt with those kinds of things, right? That lack of autonomy, that lack of voice, that is the kind of the dehumanizing process that I think is happened definitely during the pandemic, but also existed in conditions prior to and after the pandemic.
Right. And then those systems nobody's challenging those systems, right? So, going back to sort of where we started with the whole sort of capitalist project, it depends on that system and those workers to keep being carted to those different places of work. And it depends on that alienation, right? And because if there's alienation, then there's no resistance. There's no reason or ability to organize to resist. So it becomes a very effective system. So we're talking about these migrants, in a very abstract sense, of course. But I'm wondering also, I don't want to keep them totally abstract, but to what extent, Gayatri, when you've been working on these kinds of projects and, with migrant workers, for example, what consciousness would you attribute to them for their awareness and understanding of these systems? Can you say a little bit about that?
There have been very interesting and important interventions that have been made with respect to migrant workers. Even some states, for example, have recognized that migrant workers constitute a very important part of their labor force, and therefore, create various kinds of systems to build in access to public services. So the translation of health materials, the provision of schools where kids from migrant families can go to. Those have all been actually fairly important. And you see, for example, in the state of Kerala, all these different kinds of interventions taking place where you have, if you go to a health center, you have you have places where you are able to express what is happening to you in Bangla and have someone who doesn't speak Bengali understand it, right? So I do want to recognize those systems that have taken place, and that through the efforts of migrant workers organizations, of labor unions that have recognized that in order for them to be effective, they actually have to take migrant workers' conditions seriously and take them forward in building systems of accountability. The broader process of demanding accountability, though, is or the broader experience of demanding accountability, though, is not terribly hopeful. You are seeing processes where as long as a system of migrant labor, cheap migrant labor, becomes the mainstay of your processes of accumulation, and you build into it a politics of nationalism, of sons of the soil, etc., you're already creating a really flammable situation of bodies that are moving, and moving bodies have always been rendered suspicious, of sons of the soil kind of politics that is catering to some of the basest of political sensibilities. And you have a certain kind of institutional move not to address migrant workers as votes-bearing citizens, right? As people whose conditions of work you're not going to interfere in, and you're not going to make it possible for them to demand accountability. So it becomes this kind of self-serving kind of set of processes that I think are something that we really have to think quite carefully about. What are the ways in which we are going to be able to make an intervention in this that is going to build systems of accountability. Because right now, migrant workers perhaps want accountability. No one else does.
Right. Who else does it benefit?
No one else does, right? And in the little essay that I wrote, part of the story was about, if you have a migrant labor force as large as India's, then surely you should have voting systems that allow for this constituency of Indians to vote, to cast their vote. And if, despite this being brought up at the highest levels of governance, you still haven't done anything about it, then how are we to read this outcome other than, some level of either complicity or I really don't care?
Right. Oh, such a good point, because we know that, yes, India is a huge country with a lot of people, but they also have systems in place that could count and give people access to voting opportunities, right? So it's not like it's too difficult of a process. So I think you're spot on for noting that there's other reasons for not offering them that opportunity to vote. And I did want to, I'm glad you brought up voting, because I did want to sort of touch on that a little bit. You know, US is coming to our election season pretty soon, and we've watched many other cycles of elections across the world. One thing I'm always struck by here in the US is how so many people say, oh, my vote doesn't matter. You know, of course, we do have a strange voting system here, but we won't go there. But that our vote doesn't matter, so why bother, right? And Gayatri, when you talked about voting, and Kaniqua also with the, you know, similar kind of situation with people in prison, right? What does it mean? What does it mean to vote? What does it mean to be able to have that ability to have your voice count in an election?
And that's the answer. Voting means you have a voice. Voting means you have something to say, you have an opinion, and you should have that right to have your opinion. When you are not considered equal, when you are considered less than, no one cares about your voice. Hence why it took forever for Black people to get their right to vote.
Yeah.
Hence why it took a while for women to get their right to vote. Hence why we're still fighting for all prisoners to get the right to vote, right? In some states, you know, if you were a felon, you're able to vote. Not in all states, of course. But if you matter, if you are a part of this country, if you are a citizen, then you should be able to share your voice. Now, there's this belief like my vote doesn't matter, because we've seen tradition in which, you know, this movement, this gerrymandering, the redistricting, the, you know, redrawing of maps to make sure that certain groups have less power. We see that. But now, well, not just now, I think we need to go back to, well, what is the meaning of the votes? And not just voting on the presidential level, but also the local level.
Mm-hmm.
But first, we need to make sure that everyone has the right to have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you have people in power constantly seeking to remove the right, because one, they want to ensure their power, and two, they see no value in you. So now that you have that right that other people are still fighting to have, you have that voice. So speak.
Mm-hmm.
So voting is very important. Voting, of course, like I'm always about, go out and vote. Because we're still fighting as a part of our voices, as a part of our voting, we're fighting for others to exist.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the voting. Like, yes, now I have my right. Let me fight for you, because you don't have that right yet. So if we are a community, if we are allies, if we are, as we say, we care for each other, then we should use the right that we have that others don't have to fight for their right to have their voices. And I'm speaking right now, especially in regards to the prison population. Why don't they have a voice in their own experience?
Right. Yeah.
I think when I think about voting, there are a couple of different things that, you know, come to mind. I mean, it's not going to change anything, really. But as I think Mukulika Banerjee kind of pointed out, there's a certain kind of sacredness to the ritual of voting that the poor kind of participate in. Because in that one moment of casting your ballot, in a lifetime of experiencing inequality, you are equal. Because your vote matters as much as the next person. And I think that's she captured it extraordinarily beautifully in terms of understanding that kind of the cultural value that issues from participating in a national election. There's, I think, another aspect to it which kind of came to mind when I was working with doing my research with urban squatter settlements in Mumbai, and getting on the voters list for populations who do not have other forms of documentation, right? And I mean documentation in terms of having all the kinds of things that citizens typically have to proffer in order to get access to public services, et cetera, is extraordinarily important, because then that becomes your proof that you exist.
Yeah.
Right? And for people who are fighting to get housing rights, with every eviction, your papers may have been thrown out, may have been bulldozed, all of those different kinds of things. But you at least knew that your name existed on the voter list in the Election Commission office.
Right.
And that became a way to prove that you exist and therefore had a right to public goods and services in that locality.
Right.
And to demand accountability. So I think that and I think there are multiple other ways of thinking about voting, but I think voting, these are two important ways in which I've been made to think about voting with the populations that I've been working with.
And so even like we always make this phrase like power to the people power is in the voting, right? It's like use your voice, use your vote to, fight for your people. Use your voice to say something about what's going on. So yeah, voting is key, is critical. And it's so powerful, that's why people try to take it away. If it wasn't so important, they won't take it away.
See, Kaniqua, I think in India, or at least the population that I worked with, the power to the people was never going to issue out of the act of voting.
Mm-hmm.
Most of these people, were courted for their vote, but not because they could demand anything, because of the fact that they lived in informal settlements. Right. Or they worked in informality becomes part of the way in which a part of this transaction where, all of this is informal, right? Yes. The relationships, all these relationships become informalized. But I do think voting becomes an important way through which the invisible were rendered visible even momentarily.
And I agree with you, where like you said, voting is not the only way for people to have power. And it's largely in these, the voting, but also in the informal networks, the informal organization, the informal work, the secret work, the hidden work, all that. It's like, how can we harness all of that even to help get the power to vote or get the right to vote? So yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, because that's even, in the population which I look at in the US. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love what you said, Gayatri, that, just at that moment of voting, you're equal, right? Because you have a vote. And
that's Kaniqua Robinson.
Yeah, okay. Yes, but it's beautiful. Yeah. And I think, yes, ideally that's the case also in the US. However, there's also these other systems and, where some people's votes, depending on where they are living, may matter a little less, but it doesn't change perhaps the value of the vote anyway, right? I mean, even though we know that there's some challenges with our US voting systems, that is that moment of putting your voice out there in an equal, that is at that moment equal, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think we should probably wrap this up. This has been such a really good conversation, and we've touched on so many different things, but I want to also give you a chance if there's anything you want to end with as sort of what do you think that are some lessons from either our discussion or your writings or your research that you would like to leave people with? So we've touched on so many things. What are some points that you either want to underscore or say that we haven't really been able to touch on yet?
There are so many things. I don't know what I want to leave with, but it's the fact of you always have agency in your own way. No one can control well, of course, people seek to control your agency, but don't silence yourself. Do what you need to do to exist, to see yourself. Even if that means like in the context of the prison labor, in the context of just economic inequality, never silence yourself. Always use any avenue you can to say what you have to say, even if it's social media, even if it's being a part of a union, even if it's talking to a friend. You are a part of this world, and what you have to say matters. And, you know, you have a legacy in this country of people who have been, leading movements of pushing, and we still have so much to go. Even with this election, I am excited to see what's going to happen. A little bit nervous, but regardless, always push forward because you will be here tomorrow. So be who you need to be today so you can be great tomorrow.
Thanks, Kaniqua. That's a terribly hopeful note, because and I'm glad we have that to think about, because we do need that, right? And I do think that perhaps one of the things that we need to be thinking about as we go forward is, what are the kinds of ways of seeing that we need to cultivate in order to be able to understand what it's going to take to rethink our ideas of work and workers in a context in which, increasing numbers of people are going to be unemployed, not just for short spells, but, for much longer spells in their lifetime. How do we think about humanization and dehumanization in that particular context? What are the ways in which we need to reconfigure the relationship between the body, work, agency, and hope? That I think we really, I think lots of people are asking these questions, and lots of people are doing this work of thinking about what is now kind of very widely known as the future of work, right? What is it? What is the future of the worker? What is the future of work? Where are the moments where we need to, given the ways in which, the economies are increasingly being structured, how do we think of work outside of capital and labor?
Right.
And what would it take to think about that work outside of capital and labor that isn't silent, that isn't quiet, that isn't invisible, but is in fact regenerative, is creative, is human?
Right. And can we detach our humanity from our labor?
Right. Especially in a capitalist society, right? Yeah. I think we have these moments in time, when we are confronted with our reality in a different way, right? And so the pandemic certainly was one of those moments where, people did begin to think differently about work and about themselves and about community and all kinds of things. In the George Floyd's murder was another moment where, many more people started to realize, that there was a systemic problem of racism in the US that is, has its reproductions in other countries as well. And so it's good that we have those moments, as horrible as those moments are, but they do serve as opportunities to rethink, who are we? What do we value? And how do we get from where we are now to where we think we should be? And, we're talking, we've been talking so much about the invisibilized voices, but one thing that also seems clear is that a lot of this rests on people like us, right? So, people who have middle class standing and have access to opportunities and avenues for voicing ourselves in ways that other people don't always, right? And so I think it's important to keep thinking about also what do we in our individual lives do and can do more of to help create to that more equitable future. So tried to put there a little combination of little hope that Kaniqua was striving for, and as well as sort of some of the realities that Gayatri you also instill in the conversation. So but good, this was very, very interesting and rich conversation. And I really appreciate both of you having taken this time to talk with us and to engage in a discussion about the different forms of labor and different aspects of humanity in your work, but also in ways that relate to all of us. So thank you so much for taking this time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely. And
really was.
I'm sorry, Kaniqua, we didn't get to the poem.
No, it's fine. The Lacey Hughes part, it's fine. That was a great when I was I love that poem. When I read it for like the first time recently, I was like, this hidden poem that no one ever talked about. This is everything. He did a great job capturing it. So yeah, I just want to throw that out there. Yeah.
So we should have started with that.
I should have just said, I know you asked questions about whatever Langston Hughes said, but either way. But no, he did a great job capturing that moment of just seeing people just working. Just working, looking at you riding by people working. How he was like, and really embodying the workers, seeing people driving by. Like, I was like, this, yes. Because people just look at this like, oh, you're doing what you're supposed to do. I don't need to pay attention to you. You don't matter. Just continue to fix the railroads. Continue to do that work. Continue to pick up my trash. Continue to take out my trash. Continue to serve me food. I'm just here to do what I need to do and leave. I don't have to see you. You do not matter to me. And the fact that he had that same conversation earlier in 1900s, talking about railroad, well, I forgot the name of it, but talking about these convict leased prisoners, how he's just like, yeah, they're just, on the side of the road while I drive this, well, again, it's from the position of the prisoner, but like, yeah, you see people just drive by and you're like, ooh, one day I want to be in that car. Oh, look at that car, but I'm over here just working.
Yeah, yeah.
Imagine where you just, I want to be great too. Do you not see me? Well, drive by, thank you.
Yeah.
The poem was everything.
Super evocative, for sure. I mean, you can feel yourself right there.
Right. So yeah, that was like 2 seconds from the poem. I know it didn't make, it was at the end, but still be hopeful. But it's just the fact of, these people who we see every day, every 5 minutes of our life, we go to McDonald's, we go to, well, there's no train station in South Carolina, but we go to anywhere and you may see genders cleaning and you just walk by them like they're just a part of the walls. You are a part of the street. I know you are cleaning the street. I know you're taking my trash out. I know you're making sure that this area look beautiful, but I don't have to see you. I don't even have to say hello to you because you're just part of the street.
Right. And imagine what our lives would be like without them.
Imagine. And then like, why can't people simply say hello? Like, hello, person. How are you doing today?
Right.
Because you're here and I'm here.
I see you.
I see you. Like, yeah. So yeah, that poem was amazing. Thank you for talking about it and bringing that up, you guys.
All right.
Okay, well, thanks, Lisa, for this.
Yeah.
This is lovely. Thanks, Kaniqua. It's lovely to meet you.
It's great to meet you too. It was awesome conversation. Even though I may have been coughing a little bit, but it was awesome conversation.